Hey there drone fans, Rick here again from Drone Valley. In today's video, I'd like to show you the brand new protective case that DJI just released for their Action 2 camera. And I not only want to show you how to use the case with your camera, but I'd like to dive into some of the science behind why this case is important to use with your camera, not only to protect it from dropping it and scratching it and banging it, but also with the thermal management inside the camera. Because I know when the camera first came out, there were a lot of people out there, and the internet's great for this, that would immediately start picking on it and say, oh, the camera gets really hot, I burned my fingers on it. Nonsense. It does get warm, there's no doubt about that, but you're dealing with a camera that's incredibly tiny and it does amazing things. So you've got a lot of circuitry inside there that are drinking electrons and sweating, and that heat has to come out of the camera, so of course it's going to get warm, and actually it's designed to get warm. But then the other challenge was there's circuitry inside the camera that if it gets too hot, it's going to turn off. And that's a protection mechanism that I appreciate. I don't want the thing to burn up. So if I'm using it in circumstances that would get it way too hot to operate, I want the camera to turn off. Well, what this case does is really two things, two types of protection. Physical protection that actually keeps the camera nice and new, so if you drop it in the dirt, it's not going to get scratched up. If it gets banged around in your kit, you're not going to get scratches and dings on it. But probably more importantly, it helps with thermal management, and that will really allow the camera to run longer when the case is applied. And my recommendation is get the case, use it every time you use the camera, because it definitely helps with the thermal side of it. And the challenge here is that everybody's got an opinion. So there's going to be a lot of clips out there saying it doesn't work, it's snake oil, just don't waste your time with it. But science doesn't lie, math doesn't lie, and that's what I love about science. Being an engineer is that you can test this kind of stuff. You can look into exactly what the product provides and how that may or may not impact the product. So a lot of times products are released and they don't really do what they say. This one was designed from the ground up to address the physical protection as well as the thermal protection on the Action 2. And I'm going to give you a lot of science behind that, because thermal management is one of those esoteric sciences that's part of the engineering discipline that is involved with every piece of electronics ever released. And I've spent my entire career in engineering, and I can tell you any product I've worked on that's been designed by a team I was involved with, one of the main things you're thinking about is how do I evacuate the heat that actually develops inside that product. And if it's a computer, you're using things like heat fins and fans. But if it's a consumer electronics product like this, the challenge is even bigger, and it gets even bigger when you shrink it down small like this. So I'll get into all that in a minute, but I'm going to divide the clip into 4 different sections. The first one has to do with protection, mostly physical protection. Then I'm going to talk a lot about the thermal characteristics of this, because it's important you understand at some level the physics behind how things get hot. And more importantly, when they get hot, how do you evacuate that heat? How do I keep it cool and keep it operating? And then I'll talk a little bit about the detection circuitry, because I love these kind of puzzles. I'm a big puzzler. And when DJI came out with this, I thought to myself, all right, they've got a protective case, and it triggers something inside the camera. It triggers some kind of circuitry and behavior inside the camera that's different if the case isn't attached. So right away, I'm thinking about how does it detect it? What does it actually do? What does it affect inside the camera? So I'll dive into some of that, because I've had this for a couple of weeks, and I'm telling you, myself and my son have been going crazy investigating this, looking into things like how does it evacuate the heat? How is it detected inside the camera? All the things that I really care about. And I think as a nerd, those are interesting things, because it really asks more questions than it answers in some ways, and I'll get into that in a minute. And then last, I'll talk about the firmware. I could actually talk about that first. When you want to use this case, you've got to go to the newest firmware, because it updates the camera to be able to recognize the fact that the case is on there. And the version of firmware you want in this, and it'll happen automatically when you boot up your camera, is you want V01.03.30.20. That's the latest version of firmware for the Action camera, the Action 2 camera, and it'll automatically update when you connect up to the Mimo app. But download that firmware, because it fixes the, not fixes, but it detects the camera case, and it does some magical things inside the camera, and I'll get into that in a little bit, that change the way it reacts to heat. All right, so let's talk about the case itself. The case is nothing special to look at. So when you get it, you're going to look at it and go, okay, it's a plastic case. Well, that'd be your first mistake. It's not plastic. It's actually a composite material. It's a polymer. So what that means is, physically, when you install it on your camera, it naturally will protect the surface, because the camera itself is made out of aluminum, which is great, but just like a lot of electronic products, when you're designing it, there's this balancing act you go through between fashion and functionality. And a great example of that is any of the new smartphones. Like, I've got a brand new iPhone. There's glass on both sides of that phone. So the minute I take it out of the box, my first thought is, I'm going to drop this. And I almost think the design was set up so you would drop it and have to replace the phone. But if you drop that phone once on a hard surface, you're going to crack one of those two sides. So what's the first thing you do? You go out and buy a case for it. Well, you could design it with a case on it. And I think what you're looking at there is companies looking at how people want to use the product and having that fashion sense of showing off that gold iPhone or that red iPhone or whatever and not putting a big clunky case on it. But from a protection perspective, you want a case on the unit. So the design on this is phenomenal. I mean, it's a work of art the way this is put together, how small it is, how functional it is, the nice smooth aluminum surface, and that's great. And it is really durable, so you can use it without a case and you're fine, but you're probably going to get scratches on there over time or nicks on the outside. The glass is exposed. So the first thing the case does when you pop it on there is it adds a layer of protection in a couple of ways. Number one, it protects the surface, so it's not going to get scratched or banged up in your bag. But second, and probably just as important, when you pop it on there, because this case is made out of a composite material, it can absorb shocks. So what happens there is because of the elasticity built into it, when you're dropping it on the ground, the kinetic energy that's developed as it's falling has to dissipate someplace when it abruptly stops when it hits the ground. And if you don't have a case on it like this, that gets transferred inside the camera and it's going to shake up all the electronics inside, which is not a good thing because printed circuits can work loose from boards and there's a ton of components inside there. So having a case like this on it at least adds a tiny bit of protection, the elasticity of the polymer, so when that kinetic energy has to be dissipated when it hits the ground, it absorbs a lot of that and passes less of it into the camera. So in addition to protecting the surfaces, it's also making it safer for drops and falls and bangs and things like that. That's the physical protection. Now where it gets really interesting for me is the thermal management side of it, because one of the complaints that a lot of people had about the camera is it gets warm. And it does get warm because it's small. Any electronics that's operating, that's drinking electronics and doing something electronically is going to generate heat. And you have to deal with that. As a manufacturer, you have to decide, how do I dissipate that heat? How can I evacuate that heat away from the chips that are actually causing that heat? And DJI did a great job here. They actually built this out of aluminum. And when you're trying, and let me step back a second, when you're trying to dissipate heat, there's really two ways you can do that. Conduction or convection. Now conduction is surface to surface heat transfer. So in this case, inside there, I'm sure there's a lot of thermal paste that connects those hot components to the outside of the case. So you've got a physical connection between the components and the physical case itself. Where convection comes in is convection is between a surface and some other material, in this case the air. So the aluminum will absorb the heat from inside, so it's a bit of a thermal reservoir, but it also has to get rid of that heat because heat's an interesting property where it wants to find equilibrium. So if there's a hot surface and a cold surface, typically those two surfaces will find some temperature between the hot and the cold to balance out. In convection, the heat actually is escaping from that physical surface into the air. And the challenge with that is the aluminum is really good for conduction, to get the heat away from the chips and be a bit of a reservoir where it can hang on to that heat, and then convection will pull it away from the outside surface. So what can you do to improve that? Well, a couple of things. Number one, the camera only has a certain surface area. And even as good as aluminum is, that surface area is limited, and convection depends on how much surface area I've got to evacuate that heat. So can I increase the surface area? You absolutely can, and the case does that, and I'll show you in a minute. The other thing is there a way that I can increase the movement of that heat to another surface? So for example, conduction to the aluminum is good, but if I can conduct the heat away from the aluminum and have a bigger reservoir, which I do have in this case, that's good because it pulls the heat away from the aluminum, lets the aluminum absorb more heat from inside the camera, and then this has all the heat in it. So this is now the reservoir. So the first thing it does is help to pull the heat away from the aluminum, because studies have been done out there, and I'll show you a chart right now. What you're going to see here is that from conductivity perspective, basically you're looking at aluminum being about 225 watts per Kelvin meter, which is okay, that's a great one. But if you look closer, when you move down to a composite, you're up to 370 watts per Kelvin meter. Now, what's interesting about that, forget about the metric, it's much bigger, right? So aluminum to composite is bigger. There are polymers on the market today. I'm not sure this is made of those polymers that are engineered polymers that'll take it up to 600 or 1,000 kelvins per meter. So it's a much more conductive material to pull that heat away. So what DJI has done, and again, it looks simple, but it's very complex, is they picked a polymer that can evacuate heat from the aluminum surface into this reservoir, and they took it a step further. Because the next thing you want to contend with is convection. How do I get the heat away from the surface? Now, a flat surface is okay, but it's not great. If I can somehow increase that surface area, I can increase the convection capabilities of that product, and that's again what they did here. So the first thing they did was it's a little larger, not much larger, but a little larger than the camera, which means I've got a bigger reservoir and I've got a bigger surface to emit that out so convection can take over. But they also did a couple of other things. Like if you've studied heat management, like I have, and I'm a super nerd, there are things like microscopic texturing where I can take the surface and actually rough it up a little bit to give it peaks and valleys, and that increases the surface area. It doesn't seem like it would, but it does. And if you look closely, I've got a bunch of other products over here that are standard cameras. All of these have sort of composite exteriors. Even the original Osmo Action has a composite exterior, and it's got that micro contouring on it as well. This one is the first one they've released outside of their portable pockets that has a smooth surface. So I think there's always been a plan to come out with a case. Maybe it should have been included with the original. I don't know. But anyway, the case is here today. But that micro forming, if you will, in the surface gives you a bigger surface area. Now, the simplest example I can give you is using a couple of coasters. Now, this is a dumb example, but bear with me on this. Let's pretend for a second that this is the surface of the camera, right? And convection is taking place and the heat's dissipating out into the air. And that surface is a limited surface. Well, wouldn't it be cool if I could basically create a triangle on top of that surface, right? So if I can create a peak on that surface, I've effectively doubled the surface area of that product just by adding a little bit of height to it. So I've gone from a two-dimensional surface to a three-dimensional surface like this, which now doubles that surface area. So automatically, it's going to have twice the ability to sort of get that heat off of that surface. Well, that's exactly what that micro contouring does, because it creates a ton of little peaks and valleys across the surface. Now, I'm going to show you some blow-ups of what the original surface looks like and what this surface looks like, just to show you the difference between them. So this first picture, you're looking at the actual camera surface, and you can see it's flat. It's got a bit of texture to it, but it's not really pronounced. The next one is the actual case surface. Now, if you look at that closely, like I mentioned before, they've increased the surface area because they've got rounded corners. They've also made it a little bit bigger, so it's a bigger reservoir for the heat. But if you look closely, you're going to see they've done microscopic texturing on there. So looking at it, you can see that surface is rough. And every bit of those little rough portions in there are height. There's 3 dimensions to it. So it's actually giving you more surface area to actually evacuate that heat. The other thing it does is it's also better for higher heat convection, meaning I can actually get rid of more heat on that surface. But I think, and I can't test this because I don't have a laboratory, but I think they've also got a coating on there. Now, one of the interesting things about heat management is graphite is a great coating to actually evacuate heat more cleanly. So if you built this out of graphite purely, graphite's not that great for conduction, but it's great for convection. You'd want a graphite coating on top of it. And I think, if I'm betting man, and I sent this out to a science lab to have it analyzed, that there's some graphite involved in that surface as well. And that has to do with diffusing the heat, because convection's one way to get heat off a surface, which is basically heat being transferred to air. And a good example of that is if you're at home, don't do this, but if you're at home or you're camping, if you're near a heat source, whether it be a fire or your stove, you'll notice when you put your hands over it, you'll feel the heat. The closer you get to it, the hotter it gets. That's convection in action. Diffusion is different. Diffusion, to give you an example of that, diffusion is sort of that phenomenon where if you're in a room and somebody across the room or even another room squirts a little bit of perfume, you can smell it in the room. Now, how did it get from that room to this room? It diffused. It basically went out there and touched everything it could touch in that secondary medium, which is air, and moved into your room. Well, 2 things are going on in the surface of this. Convection, certainly, so it's going to be warmer as you get closer, but diffusion's also taking place. So adding graphite to it increases the diffusion capabilities of the surface to not only handle the convection side of it, but send that heat as far away from the case as possible. Now, to look at the case, if you're not a nerd like me, and there's a lot of you out there that are nerds like me, to look at this case, you're thinking, it's just a plastic case, just snap it on there. Okay, it's not gonna get banged up when I drop it. You don't think about the thermal properties, and I know a lot of people are already speculating that it doesn't really do anything for the thermal properties. And honestly, I think with the announcement, I think there was a misstatement in there because they talk about it being an insulating case, and that's the exact opposite of what you want to do, because an insulator prevents thermal conduction, which would mean they keep more heat inside the camera. So I don't think they meant to say conduction. I meant insulator. I think they meant to say conduction. But anyway, the case is designed to basically do 2 things from a thermal perspective: increase the surface area through that micro contouring and sort of making it bigger, and also having, I think, some kind of graphite treatment on top of it that helps with the diffusion aspects of it as well. But I did some testing, and here's where it gets tricky, because if I do a test, every time I do a test, I'll put it up, I'll put the results up, and I'll put the numbers up. And somebody will come along and say, okay, yeah, did that, but what if you did this? What if you did that? And if you're in science, you can do 100 experiments. You're never going to please everybody. But bottom line, DJI did some testing themselves in a room with still air, and they gave you sort of the advancements that you'll get by using this case. And from my perspective, if the case is out there, and by the way, it's free. So if you bought the camera from DJI, you can send them a note. They'll send you a case. You can check where you bought it. They'll send you a case. use the case, put the case on there. There's no downside to using the case. And again, it gives you physical protection and thermal protection inside the unit. All right, so now the next thing I wanted to talk about was detection, because this is the thing that I love. And I'm a puzzler, like I'd mentioned. We have a game room in the house where we play cards and play board games. I got a ton of puzzles in there because I love puzzles. I love picking things apart and figuring out how they come apart. So when I heard that this was detection, I thought to myself, well, there's only 3 ways you can detect something on a camera. It's either physical, where you're touching something like a button, could be optical, where you're blocking some sensor or something, or it can be electromechanical. In this case, it's actually a magnet. And that's the third thing. So we started experimenting. We got a bunch of bar magnets out, started moving the bar magnet around the top of the unit, and we found the spot where you can actually trigger that case. So when you hit it, inside the case, there's a sensor, it's probably an inductor, that sees that magnetic change in flux, and it says, okay, something happened outside, I'm gonna react to that. Inside the case, if you look closely, up in here, there's a tiny little flat magnet in there, so when you slide this on the unit, the camera itself detects that magnet and kicks in this new program. Now, a lot of people said it doesn't really do anything except down the clocking on the internal components, so it lowers the clock speed of the components, which we all know, the lower the clock speed, the less heat it generates. It's not doing that. What it's doing, from my perspective, and I'll tell you why in a second, is it's actually telling the camera that I've installed this brand new thermal energy management system outside of you, so it's okay to run a little hotter. It's okay for that chip to get a little hotter. You're gonna have to trust me that I have the ability to evacuate more heat because of this case, and you're gonna be able to run longer and run hotter while I'm evacuating that heat. And to prove that point, if you read closely on the message that comes up, because when you pop the case on, a little message comes up and tells you that the magnetic protective case is installed. Okay, great. Camera usage time extended, great. But then here's the important part. Do not remove the protective case during recording as camera temperature is too high. Now, that tells me that the camera got warmer inside, and if you're operating it, you yank the case off, it still thinks that it's got the ability to evacuate that heat, even though the case isn't on there anymore. So if you're using the case, leave the case on the unit. I don't know why you'd ever use the camera without the case at this point, quite honestly, but that proves to you that that detection circuitry allows the camera to run hotter, knowing that the case can evacuate the additional heat that's going to be generated. And overall, I think, what a brilliant solution in a lot of ways. And I use that word sparingly in a lot of the clips I do, but when I think about the engineering team at DJI that put this camera in the market and said, it's gonna work just great. As long as you're using it as an action camera, it's gonna get a little warm, but it's gonna be fine, because when you're using it as an action camera, you're moving around, there's air going past it, it's gonna evacuate the heat real well. Where it's gonna get tricky is if you have it set up on a tripod and you're in Arizona and it's in the direct sunlight, and you start turning on all the whiz-bang features like horizon level and stability inside the camera, the electronic image stabilization, all those things activate different circuitry inside the camera, and all of those generate additional heat. So in that case, no, it's probably going to get a little bit warmer, but my question would be, why would you turn all that stuff on? If you've got this thing set up on a tripod, you don't need horizon level. You can level it in the tripod. You don't need steady image stabilization because it's not moving. So turn everything off except the camera. Run it at 4K 60 frames a second or 120, whatever you want to record at. Record it, but turn all those extra features off, and you're not wasting all that energy with features you're not actually using. But my original point was, it's an action camera, and the word's right in the title of it. It's an action too. So if you're moving around with the camera, it's strapped to your car, it's strapped to your skis, it's strapped to your parachute, and you're out there moving, there's air going past the camera, so it's gonna get cool. It's gonna evacuate that heat on its own. Having the case on it means it's gonna improve that heat management capability of the camera, and it's something you should absolutely use. All right, so I think that was really all I wanted to talk about. I know I went on a little bit more on the nerdy stuff than I needed to, probably, but I always like to understand the science behind it, because to look at this, when it pops out of the box and you get this, you're gonna look at it and go, all right, big deal. Plastic case, I stick it on there. How much of an impact can I have? I'm here to tell you, it's a major impact. It not only protects it from drops and scratches and bangs, but the thermal management capabilities that this case provides for the camera really change the game as far as the usefulness of the camera. You can record longer with it, you can record higher resolutions with it, you can record in higher temperatures with it. The case is a major improvement, and I think it's a big deal that DJI released it. And I know I sound like I'm sort of defending DJI here, but how many times have we bought products that are electronic that didn't work as we expected, and the company just said, oh yeah, we know about that, we're gonna fix it in the next generation. So for DJI to take the engineering resources, the time, and the funding to go back to say, all right, some people in certain circumstances are having trouble with the camera, having thermal issues and turning off faster than they should or thought they should, why don't we see if we can come up with a fix? So as an engineer sitting in that lab, I'm thinking to myself, all right, first of all, we have to let the camera know that we're putting something on it wait a minute, we have a detection circuit in there, which kind of begs the question, why is that circuit in there when there's only detect in this case? I mean, if the circuitry's in there to detect some external thing being attached, it makes me wonder, are there other attachments coming? But anyway, okay, we can detect it. Now, how do we evacuate the heat better? Well, we know that polymers and composites have better thermal conductivity ratios, so if we put a polymer case around it, that'll evacuate the heat. All right, but then it gets into the case. How do we evacuate it from the case? Well, if we do this micro sculpting, we can actually create surfaces like fins on the surface and add a little graphite in there, and that'll evacuate the heat through convection and diffusion. Oh, that's wonderful stuff. Let's build it. So they built it. And they didn't just build it as an add-on, they built it as something. They said, you know what, a lot of people have an issue with this. We don't think it's a big deal, but we're building the case. We're gonna send it to you free. How can you pick on a company like that? Okay, I think that stands behind their reputation of being a company that really cares about the customer that buys their products and is willing to do things that are kind of unnatural for most companies of their size to fix issues that customers might think are in their product. So good on you, DJI, for coming out with this. I'm glad I got it early. I'm glad I got a chance to test it. And I hope you found this clip helpful, because for me, getting the case was cool, showing you how to use it was cool, and I'll show you how to put it on in a second. I'll do a close-up. But in general, coming out with the case and making it available to people to put on their units for free, I think is a wonderful thing. So if you stay tuned next, I'll actually show you how to use the case. It couldn't be simpler. You just basically snap it on there, but I'll also show you the display and how that gives you that message. But again, DJI, great job on this product. The Action 2 protective case includes two separate modules, one that fits the camera and a second one that's perfectly engineered to accommodate the accessory modules. And this works equally well with both the display module and the battery module. Both of the cases are made from a composite polymer material, which makes them really lightweight and incredibly durable. And you'll notice a bit of a roughness to the surface, and that's due to the micro texturing that's been applied to increase the surface area, which amplifies the effects of convection and diffusion and makes them incredibly efficient for evacuating heat, much more efficient than the case would do natively. You'll also notice holes in the front for the microphones, a button on the top so you can access the start and stop and record buttons, pads on the bottom to pass the electrical signals from the camera to the accessory module, as well as fingers inside the case that impact the pads on the bottom to pass those signals along, and two slots on either side to allow you to clamp on an accessory module. Now, one of the things I was really curious about was the mechanism where the camera could detect that the case had actually been slid on there. So we did a lot of investigation, and our suspicion was it was magnetic related, and of course it was. So we've got a piece of paper here. It's sort of a magnetic paper that'll detect magnetism. And when I pass this over the top of the case, watch what happens. Boom, there it is. So right about here, there's a magnet buried in that case, and that's actually what lets the camera know I've slid the case on, turn on the firmware that actually allows me to run it a little bit warmer and for a little bit longer. So that magnet's the key. And we also thought about the magnets on the bottom, because one of my concerns was the case is a little bit thick on the bottom, and if I push the accessory case away from it, because again there's distance to this as well, if I push that accessory away, is that magnet going to be weaker? Well, watch what happens when I pass that paper on the bottom of the case. Boom. There's two magnets built into the case on the bottom that actually amplify the magnetism of that bottom accessory case. So you've got a magnet on the top to trigger the mechanism to let it know the case is on, and magnets on the bottom that actually amplify the magnetic connection. Now I'll show you how to add the case. You basically sit it down on a flat surface and put the case over the front like this. Now I won't push it all the way down because I want to show you what happens when you slide it on. Watch when I slide this all the way and you'll hear a click. Watch this. It lets you know that the magnetic case has been applied. So the software now knows we've got this thermal case on the outside, triggers the software to actually make the changes needed to allow you to run this in a warmer environment or for longer in a warmer environment. Now I'll show you how to add the accessory case. So the accessory case, again, is really straightforward. You'll notice there are cutouts on either side. There are buttons here that line up. There are clamp slots right there on the bottom. There's a slot in the back to get at the micro SD card as well as the USB-C. So you've got access to all the ports you had initially. And to add this one to the case, you basically push it in from the front and it'll snap in just like that. It's not going anywhere once it's attached. And again, on the bottom of this one, you've got magnetics as well. So everything you did before you can do with it with the case on, and it doesn't affect the ability of adhering to the accessory case at all. Watch this. Boom, right like you did before. So it works just the same. It doesn't add any bulk or weight to it to speak of. I mean, it's a very thin case and it's a very lightweight case, but I love the fact that it provides that level of protection and helps with the thermal evacuation of the heat from the camera. I think they've done a great job with this product. I hope that demonstration was helpful. Now here are a few of my final thoughts about the brand new protective case from DJI for your Action 2 camera. And my first thought was, It's free, and free is always a really good thing. So if you own an Action 2 camera, make sure you reach out to DJI or the retailer you purchased it from and say, hey, send me my free protective case, because hopefully I've shown you that it not only increases the physical protection against nicks and dings and scratches when you're using this camera in the great outdoors, but it also helps with impact protection. So when you drop the camera, and you know you're going to drop the camera, as it's careening towards the surface of the earth, about to impact that concrete sidewalk, all the kinetic energy it develops on the way down has to be dispersed when it lands. And if you don't have a case on the camera, that energy gets transferred inside the camera and it can scramble the electronics. So having this protective case on the outside absorbs some of that kinetic energy and doesn't scramble the electronics inside. So physically, it's going to protect it against scratches and dings and nicks, and it's going to give you impact protection. And to be fair, a lot of the third-party cases that are on the market do that already. There are some that are rubber, some that are composite material, and they'll give you the physical protection. They won't help with the thermal protection. So the thermal management this case builds in the minute you snap it on the camera is a major improvement. So it allows you to use the camera in warmer environments. It allows you to record longer just by snapping the case on. And again, it's free. So my recommendation is, the minute you finish this video, get out there and figure out how you can get your free case, snap it on your camera, and use it every time you can. I want to talk a little bit more about the company too, because I get accused of being a DJI fanboy. I love their products. I talk about their products. Really what intrigues me about this company is the engineering behind their technology. When they sit down and develop a product, they've really thought it through. They're typically years ahead of the competition on what they're going to release. But this case is different because they released this camera almost a year ago, quite a long time ago, maybe not a year, but quite a long time ago. And people loved it. It works great. I've used it ever since it was released. I use it pretty much every day. I've never had issues with it. I know when I can and can't use it. I'm not going to be in the sun out in the Mojave Desert using it because I know that's going to affect it. But all electronics suffers from that. My iPhone, if I'm out in really bright conditions on a hot day, shuts down as well. So there's always thermal issues. And there's a small group of people that really made a big deal out of the fact that, oh, it gets really hot. No, it shuts off before I think it should. And DJI didn't ignore that. They didn't just look at the people that love it and say, oh, okay, that's great. We built a great product. Look at all these people that love it. They focused in on the group that complained about the heat and about turning off before they thought it should, and said, is there anything we can do to address that? The engineering team, can you guys come up with something that can maybe solve that problem for them? And that's after they sold the product. Most other companies would have just moved on to the next generation and announced the fact that they've got better thermal management schema in their new product. DJI didn't do that. They went back to the lab, spent a lot of time and treasure, put an engineering team on it, and challenged them to say, is there something you can release after we've already released the product that will address those thermal issues? And they came up with the case. Not only that, they didn't sell it to you as an accessory. They sent it to you for free. So you got to give them their props there. They're a company that stands behind their products, they care about their customers, and they're doing all they can to engineer fixes for things that maybe people discover in the field that maybe aren't that big a deal for most people, but if somebody's complaining, they're going to try and fix it. And this is just the latest example of that. They do it with all their products. Like I've said before, I've bought drones from them that are years old, that firmware is still being released for, that improves features and even introduces features that weren't there when I bought the product. You can't ask for more from a company. So good on you guys at DJI. I think it's a wonderful product. The fact that it's free means order it today, get in touch with them, get it sent to you, use it on your camera, and you're going to be in better shape. And that's pretty much all I had. Now, I covered a lot of material today. A lot of it was really nerdy stuff. I hope I didn't bore you. I love diving into the details of how things work and the science behind it. Hopefully you learned a little bit today. If you've got questions on this, or you think I made a mistake on anything, because I make a lot of mistakes, just drop an email below, or drop a comment below, and I'll get back to you as quickly as I can. I want to apologize in advance to any science teachers out there, physics professors out there, when I talk about conduction, convection, and diffusion, because those are topics that get mixed up pretty easily, and I tried to explain them as simply as I can, so hopefully they made sense, because all of them are really important physical properties, and it's basically how the world works. So for me as a science guy, I love talking about science, and hopefully you found that illuminating. We also have accessories for the Action 2, just like we do for all the products on the market. If you're interested in accessories and how to charge it, and how you can put a case on it, how you can mount it on different things, I've got a link below where you can go check that out on our website as well. And I just love talking about this kind of technology. So hopefully you found this beneficial. And again, I've got a lot more stuff coming, so make sure you tune into the channel. And if you haven't subscribed, hit that subscribe button, because this is a cool place to be, and you're going to want to hear about all the amazing things that are coming this summer. So thanks an awful lot for watching. And as always, happy flying.